Hi, everybody. Hi. Well, thanks for coming out tonight. It's going to be an amazing evening, and I'm thrilled to once again. This is our first Origins Project event of the year, and what a way to kick it off. I was trying to think of how to introduce Dr. William Perry, and I figured I'd rely on some others to begin, some people with some credibility. First, George Shultz, who said, throughout his life and work, William Perry has distinguished himself as a man of high intelligence, absolute integrity, rare vision, remarkable accomplishment, and an unwavering sense of humanity. Bill's engagement in the issue of nuclear security began in the mid-1940s, when, as a soldier in the U.S. Army of Occupation in Japan, he witnessed the massive devastation in the aftermath of World War II. Following his service in Japan, he became a high-level national security advisor to the U.S. government and participated in the development of reconnaissance technology that could detect Cold War nuclear threats. During the Carter administration, Bill served as Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, which, by the way, I learned yesterday is exactly the position that Dr. Strangelove had in that movie. He worked to shore up deterrence of the Soviet Union by offsetting their numerical advantage in conventional forces through the development of stealth and other force-multiplying high-technology systems still in effective use today by our military. As Secretary of Defense under President Clinton and his subsequent Track 2 diplomacy work, Bill developed a successful negotiating style that combined incisive analysis and an ability to balance diverse security concerns and effective persuasiveness. Then I thought I'd also do one quote from former Senator Sam Nunn, who said, Bill Perry has the highest A to E ratio, that's accomplishment to ego, of anyone I've ever known. And I can say, having spent time with him, that a man of amazing intellect and razor-sharp intellect and humility is certainly one of his characteristics. And I have been in awe of him, having spent some time with him before. After having spent much more time now, I'm even more in awe of him. He, at 90 years old, is sharper than most of the people I might talk to anywhere else, as you'll see. And his example of what it's possible for a human to do gives me hope for my own future. And his example of what it's possible for humanity to do gives me hope for the future. And let me bring out Dr. William Perry. Now, I should say, by the way, so that they know that you're not just the kind of guy who sits down and watches TV. That you just came back from a trip to Moscow, which I think is your 35th trip to Moscow.
My 35th trip to Russia.
Yeah, you witnessed a launch this time, but happily it wasn't the launch of nuclear weapons. What was it the launch of?
The Russian translation of my book.
Yes, exactly. So that was a good thing. And I should say, by the way, that Dr. Perry flew here in spite of having just come down yesterday with bronchitis. So he's a trooper in every way.
You may lose my voice before this evening's over, so I apologize for that.
And if we need to take a break for that, as I've told Dr. Perry, that we certainly will. Let's begin. Let's begin with you having a little drink. Yeah, because that'll probably be a good idea. It's coffee, not something special, just so you're aware. This is not Jackie Gleason. Okay. Let's begin with a nightmare, shall we?
Let's do it.
Yeah, okay. Let's go up here and begin with your nightmare.
Buried deep under these bone-dry high plains, in a covert section of a massively hardened centrifuge facility, a team is hard at work. They are members of a breakaway faction of the country's security forces, and they are busy enriching 40 kilograms of uranium. By July 3rd, they achieve their target of 90% enrichment, and then transfer the uranium to a nearby secret lab, where another team of technicians assembles it into a crude nuclear bomb. On August 31, they finished their work. They put the bomb in a packing crate labeled agricultural equipment and transported it to a nearby airfield where it is stored in a warehouse. 2 weeks later, it is removed and loaded onto an aircraft with civilian air cargo markings. It flies to Dubai, where the crate is transferred, along with other goods and equipment, to a global air transport freighter. Destination, Washington, D.C. The plane lands at Washington Dulles International Airport at 2:47 a.m. on September the 15th. By late afternoon, the crate is delivered to a warehouse in the southeast part of the district. Then, before daybreak, on September the 17th, the bomb is removed from the crate and loaded onto a delivery truck. Several hours later, an American citizen eases the truck out into traffic. She drives it to a location on Pennsylvania Avenue, midway between the White House and the Capitol building. At 11:09 a.m., she stops in the middle of traffic, climbs down onto the street, and triggers the detonator. The bomb explodes with a power of 15 kilotons. There are more than 80,000 instant deaths, including the President, the Vice President, the Speaker of the House, and the 320 members of Congress present when the bomb goes off. There are also more than 100,000 seriously wounded, and virtually no place to treat them. Telecommunication facilities throughout the greater Washington area have gone down. Soon, cable news is broadcasting scenes of vast devastation from the Capitol. A short time later, all major news outlets report receiving an identical message. The message claims that 5 more bombs are hidden in 5 different cities across the country. It says one of these bombs will be set off each week for the next 5 weeks, unless all American troops based overseas are ordered to return immediately to the U.S. homeland. The nation is hurled into panic. Everything begins shutting down. Within a half hour, the stock market drops more than 70% before trading is halted. From coast to coast, masses of people begin to stream out of cities, no matter their size or location. There is widespread gridlock. Cell phone systems are soon overwhelmed, and calls cannot go through. Internet access is impossible in many regions, and the nation is now in a constitutional crisis. By succession, the Senate President pro tem is now the country's president. But he is being treated for pancreatic cancer far from the Capitol at the Mayo Clinic. The Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, both of whom were testifying to the House Armed Services Committee on their recent budget request, are dead as well. Martial law is declared in Washington and surrounding regions, and the next day, the entire country. There is widespread looting and violence in many cities. Federal and National Guard troops are mustered. Soon there are reports of troops firing on crowds. There are increasing numbers of reports of crowds rioting against immigrants and foreigners. Within days, the military begins to construct large detention centers around the country.
Well, we thought we'd begin an upbeat note, but there's a reason. Well, let me read another quote, the quote that was actually on the cover of the poster and I think your programs, where you said, "Today, the danger of some sort of nuclear catastrophe is greater than it was during the Cold War, and most people are blissfully unaware of this danger. So why scare people?
Because this scenario you saw, as shocking as it is a very real scenario. It could happen tomorrow. In my book, I actually cover 4 nuclear nightmares. The second one being the possibility of a regional nuclear war between Pakistan and India, for example. The possibility of a war by accident, responding falsely to a false alarm. And the possibility of a war by political miscalculation, such as we almost had during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So those are all very real. They're all facing us. But they all have one thing in common, which is we don't understand it. And because we don't understand it, we're not taking the political actions we could to prevent them. So these are not natural disasters. They're man-made disasters, and they are preventable, but we're not doing what we should do to prevent them. So I'm trying to sound the alarm, not just to scare people, but to get them interested in taking the actions which lower their probability.
I think that's very important. As I mentioned, the Bulletin unveils a doomsday clock, and I've been privileged to be part of that for the last 10 years or so, 12 or so. And I get a lot of pushback saying, why are you scientists trying to just scare people? I don't know if you've noticed it. I've certainly noticed, and I think it's because we have a generation of young people, and not so young people, who've grown up without the apparent threat of nuclear war, that people my age remember when Americans were going under their desks with, and people had fallout shelters, and there was real concern about these issues. But for many, they seem complacent because for more than 70 years, none have been used. And I don't know if you find this, but when I write about nuclear weapons, which I do, there just seems to be not much concern among the public. When
I published my book, and I said, it's more likely, we're more susceptible to a nuclear catastrophe today than during the Cold War. It was a shocking statement.
Yeah.
Since then, in fact, just recently, the Bulletin of Atomic Sciences has moved their doomsday clock up to 2 minutes before midnight. That's the closest to midnight it has ever been. And there was only a relatively small number of years in the Cold War when it got that close. I would say more than 90% of the cold years, it was farther away than that.
And I have to say that I think your statements, I know certainly affected me when I was thinking about the doomsday clock level. The fact that, and it was probably the biggest surprise that most journalists who I've talked to and my colleagues have talked to, who said, how can you say that we're at a dangerous time? And you know, I suppose we'll certainly talk about that as we go on. And so I think there's a need, and I think at the end of the program we'll talk about what we can do to try and address that need to educate people on the issues, because one of the reasons you're doing what you're doing, why the Bulletin is doing what it's doing, is to try and get the public involved, because historically, and of course you have much more historical perspective than I do, if you look at when governments have moved to control nuclear weapons, it's often been because of public pressure.
Yeah.
The Non-Proliferation Treaty, worries about testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere, and so the public has to lead here rather than and as a person who was in government, it would be interesting for me to know if there's that perception when you were in government, when decisions were made about how the public would respond.
Yeah, well, I lived all through the Cold War. I'm a child of the Cold War. My first job after I left college occurred the same week as the North Koreans entered South Korea and the Korean War started. So the Cold War started at the same time my career started. And some of my experiences, for example, being in Washington, writing a report each night for the president to look at the next morning during the Cuban Missile Crisis. At that time, I thought each day I went into the analysis center would be my last day on Earth. So the Cold War was very personal, very real to me. And when it finally ended in the late 90s, in the early part of the last decade of the century, I breathed a huge sigh of relief, and I think everybody did. And we're just reluctant to pick it up again. We were reluctant to understand that those dangers have not only come back, but they come back with some features we didn't have during the Cold War. We didn't have a nuclear terrorist threat during the Cold War. We didn't have a possibility of a Pakistan-India nuclear war during the Cold War. So there are many, many new dangers beyond the ones we faced during the Cold War. And with the increasing hostility between the United States and Russia, which I had a first-hand chance to sense last week when I was in Russia, even that part is coming back again in a very serious way. We've got to do something about that.
Well, let's go back from some historical perspective. And one of the things, and by the way, I'm going to be periodically quoting you, and I am going to be quoting from your book, My Journey at the Nuclear Brink, which we will be selling outside afterwards for those who want to get signed. But it's,
if you want a Russian copy of the book, we have those too.
Yeah, okay, great. At discount, I assume. But in any case, so, you know, there's a series of amazing discussions in here, and it's a wonderful read and a sobering read. But I want to go back. I mean, throughout your professional career, you've experienced firsthand and been part of, in some sense, the arms race, which has gone from both sides. And what is interesting in the current times, we hear about the need to modernize our nuclear weapons fleet. We hear about the need to counter Russia. We hear about all these needs, and it's not new. We heard about in the 1960s. I think Kennedy during his campaign, the missile gap was a big factor. Then the window of vulnerability, which was I think was that during the Carter administration.
Yes, I had to deal with that.
Yeah, where people use these things to always somehow say we don't have enough nuclear weapons, and I want to read a quote from you here where it says. And this was actually during the Carter administration, around the time of SALT II, which wasn't approved at the time. In spite of the hopeful appearance of bilateral arms control and reduction talks between the United States and the USSR at this point in the Cold War, when I look back on those years, I see a historically all too familiar, irrational, impassioned thinking, a thinking that has led to wars throughout human history, and a thinking in the nuclear age more dangerous than ever. This thinking drove the frenzied debates on nuclear strategy, drove the huge additions in destructiveness we made in our nuclear forces, and brought us to the brink of blundering into nuclear war. It was a colossal failure of imagination not to see where this was leading. Even before the nuclear arms buildups of the 1970s and 1980s, our nuclear forces were more than enough to blow up the world. Our deterrent forces were fearsome enough to deter any rational leader. Yet we obsessively claimed inadequacies in our nuclear forces. We fantasized about a window of vulnerability. Both governments, ours and that of the Soviet Union, spread fear among their peoples. We acted as if the world had not changed with the emergence of the nuclear age, the age in which the world had changed as never before. And so maybe you could take us through some of this arms race, and we're experiencing a new arms race right now.
We are.
What's the rationale is always somehow a combination of ignorance and fear of what the other side is doing, and the need for parity, even if there's no need for parity.
Yeah. Invariably, in my classes at Stanford, some student will ask me the stupid question, how do we ever get to 70,000 nuclear weapons, 70,000 nuclear weapons between the United States and the Soviet Union? And so I've had to think about that. I've had to answer that question. And the answer is, we believed that the Soviet Union was planning to conduct a surprise attack on us. We thought about it so much we had a nickname for it. We called it a bolt out of the blue, also affectionately called a boob, a bolt out of the blue. So we had, because we expected that, we had to build enough weapons to survive that surprise attack. And then just to be sure, we built 50% more. The Soviets, what we were doing, we must be spotting a surprise attack. So they had to build a lot more to deal for the first strike. And then, to be sure, 50% more. And it ratcheted up until we got up to 70,000. It's an absurd and obscene number. It had nothing to do with the deterrence. It had to do with our mindset at the time. What I fear is I see that same mindset today, and we're off to a new nuclear arms race, like the one we had in the Cold War. It probably will be more in quality than in quantity. Nevertheless, a new nuclear arms race has already started.
And we'll talk about that. There's the $1 trillion that we may spend on.
$1.2 trillion, the number, whatever it is a huge number. But to me, as offsetting as that is, The bigger danger is, the bigger problem is the increased danger of it.
Yeah, absolutely. More nuclear weapons, more dangerous. We'll probably also talk about. I think, but it's worth pointing out. Many people don't realize that we still have an absurd number of nuclear weapons. It's not as if we still have. I think between the United States and Russia, around 10,000 nuclear weapons between the two of us, about 5,000 apiece. 1,500.
A little more than that. A little more than that.
A little more than that. And so, and there's no rational need. There's no rational reason to have that many weapons.
During President Obama's last 2 years in office, he put out a floater that he was going to arbitrarily cut our deployed nuclear forces from 1,500 to 1,000. That doesn't count another few thousand we have in reserve.
Yeah.
Cut from 1,500 to 1,000. He had a huge political backlash to it, and as a consequence did not do it. But there's no rationale, no logical view of deterrence which says you need even 1,000 nuclear weapons. It's a political issue, not a technical issue, not a military issue.
Yeah, speaking of technology then, let's go to technology, because one of the hallmarks, I think, of your career as Secretary of Defense and before being Secretary of Defense is the realization that one could use technology to counter this mad rush for more weapons. And again, I want to quote, you say, technology that allows us to understand what the other side is doing can help us get a way forward. You say better knowledge of the nuclear threat constrained worst-case threat assessments and their likely effect of increasing the scope and pace of the arms race. And better knowledge might lead to greater cooperation in the future as the enormous expense of the arms race, especially a blind one, would curtail both powers. Necessity was truly the mother of invention in the case of Cold War reconnaissance technology and led to remarkable ingenuity and intelligence successes. So this led to, I think, the strategy that you call the offset strategy, and maybe you can describe what that was.
Well, the first part of that, which was building better reconnaissance systems, so we better understood what was happening behind the Iron Curtain, what was happening in the Soviet Union. That was successful technically, but not politically, because in spite of that, we still went ahead and built 70,000 nuclear weapons. But the other part of it was improving our conventional nuclear forces, using the then emerging digital technology to make step-order improvements in the capability of our conventional forces. The reason that was so important was at that time in history, we had several 100,000 of our army in Germany, presumably prepared for an attack, an onslaught from the Red Army. But they were outnumbered about 3 to 1. So the way we offset that inferiority of numbers is we gave them tactical nuclear weapons with the authority to use those nuclear weapons in Germany if the Soviet Union attacked. That was our plan back in the 70s, to use nuclear weapons in Germany to stop a conventional assault from the Red Army. That was the plan. So what we were doing on the conventional forces during the time I was Undersecretary for Research and Engineering was bring this new digital technology to make a step, an order of magnitude improvement in the capability of our tactical weapons so that we could get away from that dependence on nuclear weapons. And we succeeded in doing that. In fact, shortly after that, we not only dropped that policy, but we took our tactical nuclear weapons out of Europe. We still have some nuclear bombs in Europe, but the tactical weapons, the artillery pieces and the mines and so on, have all been since disassembled.
So, I mean, the lesson is technology. Some people worry about the technology that brought us nuclear weapons, but technology, if used intelligently, can make us safer in other ways.
In that case, it did, yes.
But at the same time, there's a question, I think, of which is relevant for the meeting we're having here, and it's of interest. So many people may not know you're a scientist. You have a PhD in mathematics, and interestingly, you left Sylvania, where you were director of research.
I was director on the laboratories.
Because at the time they were using analog technologies, and you felt digital was the way to go. And I thought it was interesting. You talked about your managers and how the bureaucrats and how frustrating it was. And you said this syndrome, which I call the liability of leadership, appears every time a disruptive new technology is introduced. So the question I have in some sense is, in this context, we are having many disruptive new technologies, not just cyber technologies,
Right.
but AI, which is one of the things we're talking about, and autonomous weapons. Do we have a liability of leadership with regard to those new technologies? What do we need to do to catch up to try and think about how to deal with those things, which is really the content of the meeting we're having today?
I don't think we do have, in that case, a liability of leadership. We have every reason to believe that Chinese are putting a huge effort in artificial intelligence, for example. All of the evidence we have suggests that.
A tremendous amount of money.
And a tremendous amount of money. We don't have any reason to be timid about that. If we decide to compete, we can compete. And I think we are competing. But in this case at least, we do not have the leadership already firmly in our pocket. What we have to do is have the determination to move forward intelligently and carefully. But all of these technologies have two things in common. One, they can do great good. In fact, the scientist C.P. Snow said something which I thought was very, he said, technology is a great thing. With one hand, it gives you great gifts. And with the other hand, it stabs you in the back. So that's what we have to be prepared for as we pursue these technologies. It's easy to get stabbed in the back because these technologies really are two-edged swords.
Exactly, and I think, as I've often said here, fortune, the other scientist, Louis Pasteur, said fortune favors the prepared mind. And it's important to not put your head in the sand and realize what the problems are, and one of the reasons we're having this meeting. But one of the things that has come up in the meeting is that it's true that AI technology is and autonomous technologies are growing by leaps and bounds. They're largely in the commercial sector, and unlike, say, nuclear weapons, which were government produced, and so there is a question of controlling their use, or at least making sure the backstabbing part is at least moderated. And
the so-called first offset strategy was nuclear. It was when President Eisenhower decided he was not going to match the Red Army, gun for gun, tank for tank, plane for plane, and that's when. But he was going to solve that by putting tactical nuclear weapons in Germany. That was the first offset strategy. That was the one we overturned. Well, what came to be called the second offset strategy was introduced the newly emerging digital technology into our conventional forces, so we did not need to depend on nuclear weapons. When Ash Carter was the Secretary of Defense, it's our last Secretary of Defense before Secretary Mattis, he put a big emphasis on what he called the third offset strategy, how to use AI and other related new technologies. And that's a work in process. It's too early to predict how that's going to turn out.
Speaking of technology and science, it is heartening to me and interesting to me that you're a scientist. And I was asking this earlier, but as a man of science and technology in government, at a high level of government, in political office, at some level of political office, what tools did that provide you to deal with the problems at hand that may have given you an advantage over others?
Well, my PhD thesis is on partial differential equations. And I have to tell you that during the period I was Secretary of Defense, I never solved any partial differential equations. But I do believe, and I've always believed, that the analytical process, the critical way of looking at problems, the critical way of looking at what is rigorous thinking versus woolly thinking, which just comes naturally with any of the sciences, served me in very great stead. I had the reputation, I think the deserved reputation, that I could not be snowed when I was Secretary of Defense. Somebody came in to sell me a bill of goods, he had to have his facts right. And I think that training in science, whether it's physics or mathematics or chemistry or whatever, would be useful to anybody in that job. It's not that he uses the tools of the science, but he uses the way of thinking.
The scientific process, critical thinking, skepticism, estimation.
The F equal MA way of thinking, right.
Exactly, and it's I think it would be wonderful if that was shared. You don't have to be a scientist to have the way of thinking.
You don't have to.
If we teach science correctly. And one of the things I say to science students, many of whom say, should I go into physics school? I have a career in physics. And most people who take physics or chemistry or biology don't necessarily become physicists, chemists, or biologists. But that training is great for any career because of that critical thinking. People think of science as again, I've said, I think in this stage and others, as a bunch of facts. It's not a bunch of facts. It's a process for deriving facts and telling the difference between facts and nonsense.
And the way of thinking which understands what a proof is, what objective, careful thinking is.
Okay, but now let's go back to this, the Madison, and in some sense this third offset strategy, which is smart weapons. Because I thought it was interesting that in your book.
I did want to interrupt
sure.
at one point.
You can interrupt me anytime you want.
I would give my students a very difficult, real-life problem. I'd take the historical facts as they existed at that point and then project them a month or two or three forward. Maybe it was about the Korean conflict, I project them into the Korean War or whatever. And then I'd arrive at a scenario and said, now you're the Secretary of Defense or the National Security Advisor, and you have to make a recommendation to the President. Which of these two courses do you want to take? And I gave them enough facts so they could make a calculation of probabilities and expected value and so on, just like a scientist would do.
Yeah.
But I was careful to always make the calculations so close that the numerical calculation was so close that could not be the basis for judgment. So they had to take account of the qualitative factors. The qualitative factors as well as the quantitative. If they did not take account of the qualitative factors, they did not pass the exam.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. Oh, that's a great course.
So qualitative thinking, quantitative thinking is very important. It's not the whole answer.
It's not the whole thing, but without the quantitative thing, you can't, the qualitative thing become that. Unless you have the facts, it's hard to make a rational decision. You know, but you early on talked about, I guess, about battlefield advantages and novel technological offset strategies. And you said something like, success ultimately depended on three interrelated components: a new family of intelligence sensors that we could identify and locate in real time all enemy forces in the battle area, a new family of munitions that could strike those targets with great precision, that is, smart weapons, and a new way of designing attacking aircraft. I want to come back. I don't want to leave this completely still. Smart weapons are continuing to get smarter.
Yeah.
And some people want them to be so smart that humans don't have to tell them what to do. That's an issue that we've been talking about. What's your opinion about that?
I have a strong opinion about that, is that as much as I'm in favor of applying all the science we can, all the technology we can to these issues, I am no way convinced that the human thinking and human judgment is yet able to be replaced by machines. And so we have today, and I've used them extensively, something called drones, or more correctly, remotely piloted vehicles. They're not autonomous, really. There's a pilot, not in the drone, but sitting on the ground somewhere. And that pilot is the one who finally makes the decision of what to do. Mm-hmm. If you've made that drone autonomous, then you're giving the drone computer the right to make that decision. That's a huge step forward. In my humble judgment, we're not to that point yet. We may never get to that point. We're certainly not there yet.
When you say we're not there, should we be there? Should we? You think
I'm not persuaded we can be.
Yeah.
But I'm open to looking at what's being done here, but I haven't seen anything yet that said to me that we're there yet. So I'm not sure we'll ever get there.
Okay, from smart weapons, let's go to dumb weapons.
Okay.
And I want to go to missile defense, which is, in my opinion, probably the biggest waste of money that this country, well, it's hard to know if it's the biggest waste of money this country's ever invested in, but one of the biggest. And I was pleased to see that even early on, as a scientist, you said this, and this was very early in your career when people were talking about building missile defense systems. My calculations, which were meant to establish the plausibility of a defensive system against a nuclear attack, instead taught me that there is no acceptable defense against the destructive power of mass nuclear attack. The only meaningful defense is to protect the attack from happening. I concluded that our priority should not be on pouring resources into a futile defense from nuclear attack, but on preventing that attack. The fundamental realization has served as a guiding principle throughout my long career in defense.
I stand by that statement exactly. Today, you read about people criticizing our ballistic missile defense system because it failed this test or it failed that test. If that system had passed every test, it's still ineffectual. But fundamentally, the offense in ICBMs, intercontinental missiles, have a huge advantage over the defense. They can always, however many missiles you have, the fundamental tactic is to saturate you. And it's always cheaper to build missiles than it is to build defensive systems. More fundamentally, you can create artificial missiles through something called decoys, which are very, very hard to detect. In particular, a ballistic missile defense system which operates in the outer space instead of when the missile comes back in the atmosphere is particularly susceptible to those. And that's the kind of system we're building.
And the kind of system, as far as I know, we've never tested against a realistic incoming missile with decoys. As far as I know. Now, maybe you know differently, but none of the published tests always have been against a missile, but not with 1,000 or 100. You see, in space, as you're pointing out, maybe people didn't realize that, but a balloon in space looks just like a missile because there's no air. And so you just have a bunch of Mylar balloons that you release in your warhead, and you have a whole slew of them, and it's very hard to tell which is a.
I have to believe we've conducted tests against Mylar balloons, but they have never reported on the results of those tests. Even the tests they've conducted against real warhead entry are not going very well.
Yeah, they're not going very well. But your point, which again I want to hit the numerics of this, you said it not only is not effective, but I think it's destabilizing in a very negative way for the reason you just said. If you have a system that's 90% effective, which we'll never get, although George Bush at the time claimed in 2004 he was going to install, and said was about to be installed, and at the time I said we should just say it was going to be installed because it's a lot cheaper and just as effective and instead of building it. But even if it was 90% effective, I think if you calculate, instead of sending one warhead in, if you send 5 warheads in, you have more than a 50% chance of getting through. So what you're encouraging a country to do, the hard part is getting nuclear technology, but once you have it, as you said, it's cheaper. And so you're encouraging countries to build more weapons to overcome your defense system, and therefore it's naturally proliferating, if you want.
It's even more fundamental than that. Even if we got this missile defense program for free, instead of the whatever it is, $12 to $15 billion a year we spend.
$600 billion over the years we've been building it.
If it were free, it still creates a mindset which is dangerous. It leads you to believe that you can defend yourself against a nuclear attack. And if you can shoot down 95% of an incoming attack of 1,000 warheads, say, that still leaves 50 warheads to detonate your city. That's hardly something you would consider a success. You're talking probably 20, 30, 40 million casualties.
Exactly, and people talk about those numbers realistically as if somehow having only 40 million casualties is success.
Yeah.
And
it's not just the casualties. One of the things that the video that we played at the beginning should give you, just one 15 kiloton, one of the smallest ones we have.
Yeah.
That the social, the political, and the economic consequences are right up there with the physical destruction. It's just hard to imagine how this country, what kind of a country we would have if 30 or 40 or 50 million people had been killed in a nuclear attack. It's just unthinkable, really.
Okay, but it's amazing, of course, what we will hear in the press is that we need to build we need to increase our missile defense system, and it's really important to get this information out because it doesn't make us safer, it makes us less safe, as you just pointed out. Another thing that makes us less safe, and by the way, in case you're wondering about the narrative, we're going to start with the bad and end with the good, just so you don't go home and don't feel too depressed, is the nuclear alert process. The fact that we still maintain, and maybe there's a renewed Cold War, but even without after the Cold War, we still maintain many weapons on high alert status, and this means that the president has to make a decision in minutes, because intercontinental ballistic missiles can once they're launched, you're talking 30 minutes or so before impact. So someone has to, if potentially presented with a false alert, which, by the way, you were woken up 3 in the morning once, one of those famous 3 in the morning.
The reason I call these videos my nuclear nightmares is I actually had a nuclear nightmare once.
Yeah, talk about it.
Way back when I was the Undersecretary of Defense, back in the late 70s, when I got a call at 3 in the morning, and I sleepily picked up the telephone, the voice on the other end identified himself as the watch officer at the North American Air Defense Command. And the first thing he said to me was, my computer is showing 200 ICBMs on the way from the Soviet Union to the United States. I tell you, if you want to wake up in a hurry to get a phone call like that, he quickly quickly, happily, explained to me he had concluded it was a false alarm. I mean, my first thought, why in the world are you calling me? I was the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. I wasn't in the chain of command then. And he was calling me because he wanted to know what to tell the president the next morning when he briefed him on the fact that there had been this false alert. I could not figure that out over the phone. It took us 3 days to figure out what had happened, which is when the shift changed that night, the new computer operator, instead of putting the computer's operating tape in, put in a training tape. And the training tape was simulating a very realistic attack scenario. Well, we finally figured that out. The question, though, in my mind, then and always, is what if? What if there had been a different watch officer that night? And he had actually called the president, woken him at 3 in the morning, and told the president, you have 7, 8, whatever it is, minutes to decide whether to launch your ICBMs before they're destroyed in their silos. What would the president do? I don't have the answer to that. Nobody can guess what a president would do. I do not like the system which confronts a president, any president, even a rational, wealth-considered, experienced president. I don't want any president to have to make that decision. So this is something I've been campaigning against. There are a few bills in Congress now which will not pass, but I like the spirit anyway of trying to create a bill which prevents any one person, the president, from making a first strike with nuclear weapons. He has authorized to respond to a strike, but he cannot make a first strike. I have campaigned unsuccessfully for several years now to have our deterrent forces consist only of submarine and airborne, not ICBMs, because it's only the ICBMs that are subject to that problem. They're in fixed locations. Everybody knows where they are, and therefore they'll be obviously subject to attack anytime there's but underlying all of this is the belief, which I think is fundamentally incorrect, is that then the Soviet Union, today the Russia, really is planning and see him advantage to striking the United States in a surprise attack, which is just absurd.
It's absurd.
It was absurd then, it's absurd now. But what our planning and our force structure is based on that. And one of the things it does, it opens us up to the possibility, I meant a remote possibility, but the possibility of accidentally starting a nuclear war which ends our civilization. This happened, by the way, once in Russia, too, that we know about.
Exactly. I've nominated that.
I commend your attention to a movie called The Man Who Saved the World, which is a documentary on the time the Russian watch officer got that same kind of an alert.
Yeah, in fact, every time. I was just going to say, this is not unique. What your experience is not unique. It's happened a number of times. There's many books about Eric Schlosser's book on command and control. There's many books. It's terrifying to read how close we've come. And often, it's the person on the watch who basically, and in the case of the Russian case, disobeyed orders because the computer was showing that there was not 200 missiles, but one missile and then another missile and then another missile each minute. And he was ordered to launch his weapons, and he did not, because he looked at it and said, this is not how the United States would launch a nuclear strike, one and then another. And so disobeyed. And the question is... He was
reprimanded for disobeying orders instead of for saving the world.
Yeah. If happily he was alive afterwards, and lived out his life. But
think a minute about this, Lawrence. Suppose, even with a thoughtful watch officer in the United States or in Russia, suppose one of those false alarms happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis or during our Mideast alerts. Even the most thoughtful watch officer would have felt obliged, I think, to pass that word on to the command center.
Yeah. No, I think, and then your point, which again, I don't know if it emphasized in a way that I'm not sure everyone is aware, and until Donald Trump became president, many people didn't think of this. I was shocked when the first time I learned that in our system, there is no check. The president can launch nuclear weapons, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the cabinet, Congress, no one can say no. In the current system, the president has a unilateral right to say launch nuclear weapons, and there's no one in the chain of command who can say no. In principle.
In principle, that's right. In practice, it is possible for some person who's willing to risk his career and his life to intervene.
Exactly.
And just once in history, that did happen, when President Nixon was about ready to be impeached, way back ago, and was known to be doing heavy drinking. his then Secretary of Defense called the commander of the Strategic Air Command and said, if you get a call from the president ordering a launch, do nothing until you check with me. That was totally illegal and out of command, but that's what he did.
Thankfully. I was going to talk about nuclear terrorism and loose nukes, but I think the nightmares probably captures that. So I want to move briefly to North Korea.
Okay.
Because, obviously there are problems with North Korea now, but I think it's interesting because you have experience, in fact, negotiating arms, if you wish, an arms control treaty. So maybe you want to talk about that a little bit.
Well, I had two very close experiences with the North Koreans. The first one, I was Secretary of Defense. The first crisis I had as Secretary of Defense was North Korea and the nuclear weapons. And we almost went to a war with Korea over that time. We managed to work that out through a diplomatic agreement which came to be called the Agreed Framework, which had the effect of delaying the nuclear program about 10 years, but did not have the effect of dissuading them from getting nuclear weapons. In 1999, I was now out of office, back happily at Stanford, enjoying life. I get a call from the president who asked me to come temporarily back in the government on a half-time basis to negotiate with North Korea because they were up to something again. This time, instead of nuclear weapons, they were firing long-range missiles, ICBMs. And he believed, and I believe, that nobody builds an ICBM unless they have a plan for putting a nuclear weapon on the head of it. It doesn't make any military sense at all. So we took that as indirect evidence that they were still pursuing somehow a nuclear weapon. And in retrospect, we know that what they'd been doing before was building plutonium to make a nuclear weapon, that what they were doing as a backup was processing uranium to make a nuclear weapon. We didn't know that at the time, but we inferred it from that. So I was sent over to Pyongyang to talk with the North Korean leadership, which I did. And we came, after 4 days of hard discussions, we came to an agreement. An agreement by which they gave up all of their nuclear weapon programs and all of their long-range missile programs. And we did a number of things to help them, and South Korea and Japan gave them some economic benefits. This agreement, I thought, was a good agreement. I thought it basically would have stopped that program. Kim Jong-il then sent his senior marshal back to Washington to meet with President Clinton to come to final agreement on it. And that happened in October of 2000. He stopped off at Stanford first to meet with me. An interesting digression here is that Kim Jong-il had asked him to ask me to give him a tour of Silicon Valley. They would think they would like to have something like Silicon Valley. Everybody wants a Silicon Valley. So I said, sure. I took him around, all around Silicon Valley. And as it happened, a pure coincidence, it happened to be Fleet Week in San Francisco, which meant that the Navy had maybe 30 or 40 first-line ships in the San Francisco Bay, and airplanes flying over the bridge and under the bridge, and very exciting aircraft carriers under the bridge. And so as we crossed the Bay Bridge from Oakland to San Francisco on this tour, we had this huge show of the Navy. I'm sure to this day that the Marshal thought that was all for his benefit. It's a pure coincidence. We got back to Washington. He had a handshake agreement with the president, and they were set to sign an agreement within a month or so. A funny thing happened 3 weeks later, which is called an election. And in that election, President George W. Bush won the election, and shortly thereafter decided to can the discussions. And so for 2 years, there were no talks at all with the North Koreans, and the rest is history.
So, yeah, and the rest
I, to this day, believe that would have at least could have stopped the program completely. At least we'd be a hell of a lot better off than we are now.
And I think that's an important lesson, especially when we hear talk about the Iran nuclear weapons deal. People say, well, in 15 years, Iran might have nuclear weapons, but they don't have them now. And the opportunity cost of not engaging in that diplomacy at the time.
You have to always ask it, compared to what?
Yeah, exactly.
Compared to what? So if we can the Iran deal, or if we can the North Korean deal, compared to what? What's the alternative?
And we're seeing in North Korea what the alternative is right now, and how much harder it is to change things after the fact than before the fact. And
I do have a little bit of good news about North Korea.
Oh, good.
Based on my long time and careful discussions with a whole array of people in the leadership, they are not going to launch a bolt out of the blue, a surprise attack against South Korea, against Japan, against the United States. They have those nuclear weapons for a single purpose, which is to preserve the leadership, to keep the Kim regime in power. And all they have to do is fire one of those nuclear weapons in any of those countries, and they're toast, and they know that.
They know that.
So they're not going to do that, but it's still very, very dangerous, because we could, just like with Russia today, we could blunder into a war with them, a war by accident, a war by political miscalculation. That's what we need to be fearful of.
Oh, yeah. No, and in fact, we'll get there in a different way, I think. But now we're on the uphill slope, just in case you're wondering. You talked about this, about your experience in North Korea. I want to talk about arms control in general. And there's something in your book which, well, everything is insightful, but it made me think in a different way than I had before. Arms control agreements are obviously useful for controlling arms. But you point out that there's another useful reason. You say, yes, a successful arms control agreement in 1977 could have put the brake on the arms race then underway, decreasing the cost of our weapons and the threat we pose to each other. That was SALT II, which didn't happen. But even more important, it would have engaged us in a dialogue with our deadly foe, given both sides a degree of transparency, and most critically, given us a context, a better understanding of our opponent, to inform the awesome decisions we were expected to make in a heartbeat. In my judgment, the context gained was far more important than the numerical arms reductions achieved. As long as the quantitative terms of a treaty do no harm, the treaty serves a larger purpose in giving us essential context.
I think that I feel very strongly on that point, and I think it applies today as well. Let me just give you one simple example of it. When I got out of office as the Undersecretary of Defense, which is 1981, I was, to my surprise, invited by the Soviet Union to come over for a conference on arms control. Mm-hmm. So, of course, I went.
Yeah.
And at that meeting, I met a dozen or so Russians, two of which became long-term colleagues of mine. And last week, when I was in Russia, I met with those two men again. And we were busy plotting and scheming how to get the United States and Russia back to an honest and serious dialogue again. But in between that time, when I became the Secretary of Defense, one of those two men became the Deputy Minister of Defense of Russia. We had a joint project to undertake, two joint projects actually. One of them was dismantling Cold War nuclear weapons. And during the time I was in office as the Secretary, we dismantled 8,000 nuclear weapons, 8,000 nuclear weapons, wow, in full cooperation with the Russians. And the fact that I had already established this bond of trust, that we had this bond of trust between us, meant that we were able to move immediately to start getting that done, instead of having to spend another 2 years or so sparring around to decide whether we could trust each other.
Yeah.
So that's a very important part of it. And today, there's some talk about not renewing the New START Treaty. Yeah. I don't think much of the New START Treaty. It's a very modest treaty. Mm-hmm. It reduces our force to 1,500 or so deployed nuclear weapons. But it has a vehicle that calls for dialogue, continuing dialogue between the United States. It's worth maintaining the treaty just for maintaining that dialogue.
And I think it's worth stressing, I know it was an issue that came up in the Bulletin's discussions, that, and I don't know how long, you probably know this answer, this is the first time in at least my memory that there are no, as far as I know, no active arms control negotiations at the highest level between the United States and Russia. It's the first time in maybe 50 years, I don't know how far, maybe even longer.
It goes back to the early 60s, yeah.
So it's from your experience, this is really unique, the fact that we are not in dialogue on the case.
It's unique and it's crazy.
Yeah, it's really crazy. Speaking of crazy, we signed and ratified a non-proliferation treaty a long time ago under President Nixon. And you talk about diplomacy that you took part in, and you say, any meaningful success has to be at an international level, and most nations were not willing to take seriously the U.S. preaching to them that they did not need nuclear weapons when they saw the United States and Russia demonstrating that nuclear weapons were vital to their security. This hypocrisy is something that particularly upsets me. And it seems to me when we talk about other countries like North Korea, which originally signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty and then violated, we are violating the Non-Proliferation Treaty because part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty is the requirement that the nuclear nations work to disarm. Instead of saying, nuclear weapons you shouldn't have nuclear weapons, but by the way, we're going to build a whole new arsenal of nuclear weapons because we think they're important. What message does that send?
Well, this is more than hypocrisy. It is, I think, a violation of the treaty. The
Yeah.
treaty is very explicitly has the signatories who have nuclear weapons promising to work seriously towards the reduction of those nuclear weapons. And for a period of time there, maybe a golden period of maybe 6 or 7 or 8 years, we were doing that. We're certainly doing the opposite of that today. We're not just not reducing our nuclear weapons, we're actually building a whole new generation of weapons, more fearsome and more capable than the ones we now have.
Well, and literally, are we not sending North Korea and Iran the message that if they want to be protected against aggression, they should build nuclear weapons?
I suppose yes, but I must, just to clarify my thinking on that, North Korea has wanted nuclear weapons long before.
Yeah.
They've wanted since the 1980s, maybe back in the 1970s, and they've done everything they could to get them. I don't think what we're doing in the United States has much impact on North Korea. North Korea believes they need nuclear weapons to sustain this despotic regime they have in power. And I think it's a correct belief.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's not an unreasonable
That's
belief
why
at all.
That's why they're doing it. But there are lots of other countries in the world where our example is highly negative.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we, and I never.
I don't want to let North Korea off the hook, though.
Yeah, no, okay. But I never read in the mainstream media. There's a lot of things I never read in the mainstream media. But that we are in violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty ourselves, and
we are.
We point the finger at everyone else.
Mm-hmm. Not in a fuzzy way at all,
Yeah.
in a very clear and a sharp way.
Let's move to the way to the way of light, which is your way, which came, as many people know, I hope, there was a remarkably important group of people, you being one of them, and George Shultz and Sam Nunn and Henry Kissinger wrote, people that were not known to be peaceniks, wrote a very influential, at least some of them, wrote a very influential opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal arguing that we needed to proceed to a world free of nuclear weapons. And I want to talk about that Gang of Four, as you became known as, and because there's a lot of discussion about that, and I want to talk about the context of that, because people say it's unrealistic, and what I was impressed with was when you talked about the debates here, you talk about Max Campbellman, who's a veteran American diplomat, and you say, Campbellman stressed the humanistic importance of establishing oughts. He drew an analogy to the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. Although obviously it was not true in practice in America when the Declaration was signed, most of the signers believed that it ought to be. By declaring ought as a vision, our nature was able to work toward the condition, if over much time and sometimes with enormous pain. So the idea that maybe it's not the time to realistically imagine having zero nuclear weapons, that is where we ought to be. So maybe you can talk on that a little bit.
Well, the four of us believed there was going to be a long, hard road to getting to zero nuclear weapons. We might never get there. But in the meantime, there were many, many important things we could do to greatly lower the danger, and we ought to be doing those things right now, this year. Mm-hmm. And that unless we had an aspirational goal of going to, we would not achieve that. We needed this aspirational goal out there in front of us. So we all signed up to the aspirational goal in order to get moving forward on the reductions that were happening. And for 5 or 6 years, they did. And that aspirational goal was enshrined in Prague 3 months after the President Obama got into office. He said, I state clearly and with conviction the commitment of the United States to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. I can still remember how thrilled I was when I heard him say that.
Me too.
Of course, after his first term in office, he gave up pursuing that goal.
Yeah.
But in his first term of office, he did two things which were very, very significant. The first being the New START Treaty, not because it was such a big deal, but because he got the dialogue going again, which was very important. And less well known, but I think even more important, is he started something called the Nuclear Security Summits, which make us all safer from the possibility of a nuclear terrorist setting off a bomb in our cities.
And And those, actually, it's a question I was going to ask when I was reading about that, that we haven't had a nuclear security summit in this administration yet, have we?
No.
Yes. And is there any plan for that?
Not that I know of.
Yeah.
I would be surprised.
And the Nobel Prize was given this year to a group who were in favor of banning nuclear weapons. And there's been a debate, and you've been part of the debate, of people say we should ban nuclear weapons. And your argument, which I happen, I think, to agree with at this point, is that well, why don't you give your argument?
It's an aspirational goal. It's a statement of what ought to be.
Yeah.
Even if it has zero political effect. This year, next year, 5 years from now, it's an aspirational goal. So I supported it for that reason alone. I had no anticipation of it having a political impact in the foreseeable future.
But it did. I mean, as I say, President Obama mentioned it in his speech in 2009. In 2010, importantly, I don't know if it's every 8 years, the Nuclear Posture Review. How often is it done? Is it every 8 years?
Posture Review, whenever a new administration comes in.
Whenever new administration. So in 2010, for the first time in the Nuclear Posture Review, President Obama released it, and it explicitly diminished the role of nuclear weapons in American military strategy, as you wrote. Compare that, and many of us are concerned because a new Nuclear Posture Review just came out, and it does precisely the opposite in an extreme sense. Maybe you can talk about that for a second. By the way, we're going over time, but I don't care. Okay.
And the Nuclear Posture Review has less to do with posture and policy than you might imagine.
Okay.
But it does reflect a state of mind. And we see that state of mind reflected, which is very negative with relative nuclear. Yeah. It declares the importance and the emphasis of nuclear weapons in American policy, instead of working to back away from the emphasis of nuclear weapons on American policy. And it encourages the Soviet Union to do that. Now Russia, not the Soviet Union, to do the same, although they have not needed much encouragement. Yeah, they're proceeding on their own on the same. So we have leaders in the United States and leaders in Russia who are now pursuing a policy in which nuclear weapons are placed at the forefront of their military strategy and policies.
And not just existing, but potentially a new, quote-unquote, more usable arsenal of nuclear weapons, which is even more terrifying to me, at least. Yeah. I don't know if it is to you.
I think it's, there is no such thing as a usable nuclear weapon.
There should be no such thing.
It's, you can call it that.
Yeah.
The theory being that if it's a low yield, 5 kilotons say, it will not invite a nuclear response. So you can use it like a big bomb. But 5 kilotons is a low yield compared to the other weapons we have deployed.
Yeah.
But 5 kilotons is 5,000 tons of high explosive equivalent. You know, it's orders of magnitude bigger than any conventional bombs we have. And it can still destroy a city.
Yeah, exactly.
So the whole, it's a Dr. Strange-Lovian kind of terminology that we're using, I'm afraid.
Okay, now we're getting near the end. I want to go up this hill quickly, okay. which is two things that besides pushing for a world free of nuclear weapons. You've thought a lot about how to step back from the brink, which is really important because, and it's one of the things that I'm also proud that the Doomsday Clock does. It doesn't just, when we announce the Doomsday Clock, we don't just say what the dangers are. We talk about the ways to go back, which is really what all of us are interested in is how can we step back? What concrete steps can we do? Because as you said, these are not technological problems, they're political problems that can be solved. And you list 4 in your book, and I don't know if you want to go through them.
Well, let me just take a few examples.
Yeah.
On nuclear terrorism, the nuclear security summits, which President Obama started some years ago, was a very practical, useful step.
Yeah.
Reducing the likelihood the terror group could get the fissile material. If they can't get the fissile material, they can't make a bomb. So that was a very practical and useful step. That's a way of stepping back from that particular nuclear brink. In the case of starting a nuclear holocaust, by accident, a false alarm. There are 2 things that can be done. The first of all is to take our forces out of what is called launch on warning. Not have the president, the authority to launch on warning, that he is required to wait until the actual impact has occurred, which means we are risking losing our ICBMs, but we have plenty of other missiles anyway. So that would be a second thing we could do. The third thing, which is even more fundamentally, is let our ICBMs phase out, and to the extent we believe we need deterrence, to do it submarine missiles and bombers, which are not susceptible to that kind of an accidental. So those are all practical things that could be done, but which we're not doing.
Yeah, I mean, there's, as I said, there's 4 that you give in the book, and I think given time, I'll let people read them, but you've mentioned a few, but there are concrete steps we can do that are rational, that a sane nuclear weapons policy would be immediately clear we should do, and we need, and this is how I want to go to the final thing, we need to do them, and I think we both agree, as educators, that education is the important thing. And you talk in an early stage in your book about an experience you had when you were talking to the Senate, trying to get, in fact, Ash Carter, who was later on succeeded you as Secretary of Defense, but at the time was working for you, trying to get him approved by the Senate, and had some problems, and you eventually spoke to a senator and got there, and you said, from this episode and others similar to it, I understood yet again the need for raising the awareness of people about the danger of nuclear conflict and the overriding need to prevent it. People's capacity to understand was there. The requirement was to galvanize them to think and act on it. And I think I assume that's the purpose of this film and the purpose of the William J. Perry project. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
The purpose of the William J. Perry project is to do just that, to alert the public to the danger and what can be done to reduce the danger. This book, My Journey to Nuclear Brink, was the first step in that project, but I understand that if I'm lucky, 10,000 people maybe will read the book. Yeah. And I want to get the message across to millions of people. So what we've done the last few years is taken the ideas in the book, the content in the book, the message in the book, and get them on the internet. That 5-minute video you saw, it's a series of videos we have. They're all called My Nuclear Nightmares. That was just the first of them. We have 4 of them in production right now. In addition to that, we started a series of online courses. I mean, I teaching for years, of course, at Stanford, so I get across 200 students a year. I want to get that up to 200,000 or maybe a couple million, and the only way to do that is go on the internet. So we have put 2 such courses on the internet right now. You can go home tonight and sign up for one and take. They're free, no examinations. You can't ask for anything more than that. Yeah. So, but it's a way of informing people on large scale, not small scale. We have to do this wholesale basis, not a retail basis, to have success.
And you have to get people, and the films and other things like that, you have to get people motivated. I often tell teachers that the biggest mistake they make is assume their students are interested in what they have to say.
We're working with high schools, by the way, as well as colleges and kids not in any school at all.
Yeah, exactly. And you motivate them with this, and then they presumably get interested. It's the same purpose, this, and the reason I'm proud to be associated with, many reasons I'm proud to be associated with the Bulletin. The Doomsday Clock has exactly the same purpose, to get people interested enough to begin to read the Bulletin and other sources to find out what the issues are. The Stanley Foundation, similarly, to try and educate ourselves and the public to try and understand this issue. And it has been one of the privileges of my career to be able to discuss this with you. And the young man that you are, I hope you have another 90 years of being able to help convince the world. Thank you very much for this, this dialogue. Thank you.
Lawrence.
Okay, sure.
I want to end with one comment to this audience, which is, I have been asked many times why, at the age of 90, I continue to pursue this mission impossible. And I've got 11 reasons for doing that, to my 11 grandchildren. And I've promised myself that I'll do everything I can to see that they do not have to grow up, as I grew up, with the threat of a nuclear cloud hanging over my head all the time. That's my promise to myself. And put it in terms of Robert Frost, even though I'm 90, that the woods are lovely, dark and deep. But I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep. Thank you.
I hope you have many, many, many miles to go before you. I couldn't say it better. Thank you. Amazing. Truly, truly amazing. And I thank you, and we thank you. And now, as you are probably aware, if you come to these before, we're going to have an intermission. And during that intermission, you will, those of you who want to ask questions, will write them on the cards that are included in your program, and they'll be collected, and I'll go over them and we'll select some. Also, something I meant to say at the beginning, but you still have time for those Twitterizers out there. If you go to hashtag, it's hashtag Perry Krauss, is that right? I think that's the right order. Or is it Krauss Perry? Perry Krauss, hashtag Perry Krauss. If you get your, if you get those things in, we'll also have a chance to look over them. And we'll be back in a little while to answer your questions. So go out and take a rest, and we'll go back and take a rest too. Thanks again. Thanks.